Sandston managed to intercept 2 of the leeches with missiles, and Cooperstein fried the 3rd with a laser from the aft turret. But the 4th twisted in an unthinkable way and slipped toward the ship. Sandston tried to dodge it by swerving, but a muffled thump and the deck shuddering underfoot made it clear that it had landed on the hull. "I don't see her!" shouted Cooperstein. Sandston could hear him frantically fiddling inside the cramped gun turret. "It's on the other side of the hull." "Calm down." Lehmanen's confident voice came through the earphones. "I'll take care of her. Sandston, try not to make sudden moves for the next few minutes. You won't drop the leech, but I may well fly into the asteroid belt." "Copy that," Sandstone said. "Coop, keep an eye on space. Except for the thing on our hull, all seem clear. But who knows? We're getting too close to Mars to relax." The hissing and clanking of the airlock doors and Lehmanen's heavy breathing indicated that the stormtrooper had already taken up his immediate duties. He should hurry before the leech released enough of its acidic saliva on the ship's plating to make a hole and slip through. But Sandston wasn't worried. He was as sure of Lehmanen as he was of himself. Or even more so, because Sandston now strongly doubted their venture would succeed. However, he had no time for reflection. It was far more dangerous to fly here, close to the purple, blurry tumor of Mars, than in the dead belt's empty space beyond Neptune's orbit. The leech attack had just demonstrated that, and there was still the giant pseudopodia stretching for millions of kilometers from the planet like a monstrous branching fungus that braided the entire interior of the solar system. It would be foolish to crash now that they were so close to their target. "There you are, my dear." Lehmanen's triumphant voice sounded in the earpiece, followed by the grinding crackle of static. Pulse rifle shots always caused interference on just about every radio frequency, and the bulky stormtrooper from Ganymede favored over all other weapons, a true monster that an average human would have had trouble even lifting. "Oh shit. What's up?" Sandston asked anxiously. The Lehmanen's exclamation worried him. For a few seconds, only the stormtrooper's heavy breathing could be heard. Was it too heavy? Then Lehmanen said, "It's okay. You should have seen the way she was blown apart, just like some bloody fireworks." He paused. "Going back in. It's all good." "Copy that," Sandston said. Something was still bothering him. Why had Lehmanen mentioned twice that everything was fine? He never acted like a grandson, calling a strict grandmother. But he couldn't be distracted now. On one of the screens, there was a bold green line, a stem pseudopodia. The smaller outgrowths were not yet visible on the screen, but Sandston knew that there were many of them, and he had to make sure he didn't miss the moment he had to dodge them. The eye of Phobos was still too far away to fear detection, but even here, it wasn't worth taking too many risks. There would be plenty of opportunity for real risk ahead of them. He carefully steered the ship for a few more minutes, marveling at Lehmanen's unusual silence, despite his descent from the Finnish colonists of Ganymede, who were famous for their taciturnity. Lehmanen was never short on words. He switched the controls to autopilot only when Cooperstein dragged the body of a heavy combat suit-clad stormtrooper sagging helplessly into the cramped cockpit. "Sorry, guys," Lehmanen said, breathing heavily as they removed his helmet. "That thing spit on me. I didn't even notice." Sandston stared in horror at the Ganymedian's right leg. Just above the knee, a melted hole the size of a fist gaped in the suit's armor shield. Below it, the suit's pant leg dangled like an empty sack, the bottom of which had clearly accumulated some liquid. "He crawled to the airlock by himself," Cooperstein said, "but he couldn't get out. I pulled him from there. He's just now regaining consciousness." "It's nothing," Lehmanen said without opening his eyes. "It's all right. I've had worse. It's all right, guys, it's all right. Sandston finally woke up. What the hell did you bring him here for? He bellowed at Cooperstein. The little engineer, who, like all natives of Pluto, was at most 160 centimeters tall, looked at the captain, confused and frightened. He must be taken to the sickbay immediately. If the diffusion goes up his leg, they barely made it in time. At least Sandston hoped they did. It seemed like an eternity before they dragged the unconscious layman back to sickbay, while they pulled off his combat suit, trying not to spill out of it what the stormtrooper's leg had turned into, and while they laid him on the robot surgeon's table. But when Sandston looked at his watch, only 7 minutes were gone. Laymanen was now in the regeneration cocoon and would remain there until they returned. If, of course, they returned. The robot surgeon had amputated his leg at the mid-thigh. The diffusion from the leech's saliva-affected area had started to rise upward after all. Sandston wanted to believe the robot surgeon's diagnosis, which stated that the poison had not penetrated further. He sighed. There was nothing more that could be done now. It was more important to get the ship to its destination. Laymanen's injury had made their task more difficult. However, the mission was still doable, so he and Cooperstein took up their posts. Sandston again carefully guided the ship through the thickets of pseudopodia toward the monstrous blob of flesh that Mars had become. It's too bad they still didn't know how Masavich's mission had ended. His ship had never returned, and observations from observatories on Jupiter's satellites showed that the god had overgrown a large amount of protective tissue on the eye of Deimos. However, how badly that organ had been damaged was unknown. Sandston gritted his teeth tightly. Masavich was his friend. He wanted to believe that he had died for a reason. Sandston had no doubt that Masavich was dead. The question was another. What should be done for those who follow their lead? How would they know if the god had been significantly damaged? No means of surveillance could penetrate through the protective scar tissue. Who knows what's going on down there, deep in the flesh? Something sharp and jagged from a large pseudopodium on the port side suddenly flew out, aiming for the ship. Sandston instantly lay the ship in a swerve and ducked away from the new threat, shouting to Cooperstein, "Hold your fire!" Unlike leeches, the firing rod was connected directly to the god's nervous system, and although its attack on the ship was purely reflexive, triggered by the sensation of the nearby large mass and the heat radiating from the ship, any damage caused by a laser or missile would certainly cause the god to turn its attention to the wounded spot. This was to be avoided at all costs. They were gradually approaching Mars, which was growing on the screen like a monstrous tumor that had captured the entire interior of the solar system, turning it into a nightmarish Dyson sphere of densely intertwined and fused pseudopodia that had long ago swallowed Earth, Venus, and Mercury. Sandston looked where the mass detector said the sun should have been, but saw nothing but a cluster of flesh. How does one even destroy something of this magnitude? How do you kill a cosmic god? Scientists from the Crick Center argued that the loss of the eye of Deimos and the eye of Phobos, as large nerve nodes of the god, should weaken him greatly and perhaps give humans a chance for further, more successful attacks. But will they actually succeed in destroying the eyes? Sandston rubbed his forehead tiredly. It wasn't so much the prospect of almost certain death that depressed him as the fact that he wouldn't know if it had done any good. After Masavich's disappearance, he had little doubt that they were not destined to return, but he was obliged to go on this mission. He considered the motives of each member of his little team. For Cooperstein, it was simple. God was not a god. It was a hideous perversion of nature, a blasphemous monster spawned by impure human impulses. Laymanen had lost his family when the god took over and incorporated an asteroid that was home to numerous of Laymanen's relatives who had decided to start their own little family colony. Both had sufficient motives to risk the most precious thing of all, life, eternal life. 300 years ago, the Crick Center finally discovered a transformation of the human gene structure that could eliminate most diseases, aging, and death. Of course, one could still poison oneself, shoot oneself, get caught in a disaster, and die in a million other violent ways. But the concept of natural lifespan was irrevocably gone. Mankind rushed to explore the solar system, forgot about wars, and decided that utopia had arrived. Until one immortal, despite all the odds, got cancer. What happens if the immortal's cancerous tumor lives and mutates for 100 years? If it learns to attack and consume other living things? If radiation and chemical poisons no longer work on it? If it learns to use the sun's energy directly and recycle minerals? Scientists were still debating whether to consider God intelligent. They had no answer to this question since all those who had tried to find out directly did not return. When the god consumed Mars, it seemed the nightmare was finally ending. But 15 years later, the first pseudopodia rushed toward Earth. 30 years later, humans ran out of means to destroy all the god's agents. Earth had fallen. Sandstone spotted a large swarm of leeches on the long-range detection scanner screen and steered the ship in the other direction. He would not miss Mars and the Eye of Phobos, but they would not survive a second encounter with the leeches, these gods' phagocytes. It was too cold for God beyond the orbit of Mars, but the tumor couldn't help but grow. Interstellar travel remained a dream. Humanity, what was left of it, had to fight for survival, but few immortals were willing to sacrifice an unlimited future for dubious chances of victory. The motivation to live without worrying about death, bearing God, of course, always took precedence. Sandston, however, had his own motivation, a much stronger one. God was his father. No one had ever blamed Sandston for the fact that the thing that had once been his father had wiped out 4/5 of humanity and taken over nearly half the solar system. But he knew he had to at least pay for his family's sins somehow. A hard impact nearly threw Sandston out of the pilot's seat. He stared at the screens, unable to believe his eyes. Just a moment ago, space had been completely clear. Now, the ship hurtled through a dense web of God's flesh, tearing disgusting pinkish-black ropes with its angular hull and sharp outrigger pylons. A reddish mist of momentarily frozen droplets blurred in the vacuum behind. At least, no large, thick trunks were visible. Apparently, having gone partly into his thoughts, he had missed one of the typical god's catchbuds, a tightly coiled, semi-autonomous web that unfolded into a huge branching ball when any foreign object approached. The buds were barely visible on the screens, as their outer shells insulated the heat of the god's flesh. The web of catchbuds was almost harmless for Sandstone's ship due to the fragility of small ropes of flesh, but if it was connected by a nerve stem to the god, then they gave themselves away. "Coop, if you see a nerve, fry it," shouted Sandston into the microphone. Silence answered him. "Coop! Isaac, can you hear me?" Nothing. Sandston frantically typed a couple commands, redirecting one of the view cameras on the hull toward the gun turret. Shit. There was no turret. In its place was a gaping hole with jagged edges from which debris was still flying out. The gunner's chair, which Cooperstein had occupied just a moment ago, was nothing more than a ragged wreck, tangled with occasional scraps of the god's web threads that the ship had cut. Sandstone clenched the helm with all his might. First, Laymanen, and now his carelessness, killed Cooperstein. God must pay for everything. Suddenly, it occurred to him that they should have long ago gouged through the trap ball at the breakneck speed at which he was driving the ship. There was no end to the web, however. The ship had cut a long gash, and Sandstone couldn't slow down, even though he didn't realize where he was going. If he slowed down, the web would immediately begin to tighten around the ship, engulf it entirely, and turn it into a part of the god. Perhaps that was what had happened to Mazovich. Sandstone thought feverishly about what to do, but before he could think of anything, the ship finally broke free of the vile thicket. Sandstone was hit in the face by the pink-orange light of a huge spherical formation with a large bright funnel in the middle. He was looking directly into the Eye of Phobos. Contrary to the scientists' predictions, the eye was not slumbering at all. It was incredibly active. Sandstone could see something moving in the depths of the funnel that he didn't even want to think about. Apparently, the god was using a huge trapping web to cover the eye and trick people into entering the trap. Already feeling the unbelievable power of the eye's mental radiation, which broke his will, twisted and turned his consciousness inside out. Sandstone tore the transparent cover off the big red button on the console and hit it, triggering the uncontrolled acceleration of the ship's reactor, which would also detonate the antimatter bomb they were supposed to plant on the backside of the eye. "Hello, Father," he wheezed. "I'm finally returning to you." God felt tired. Will no one ever be able to kill him? Nothing tires one so much as the dream of one's own death.